I stood there watching the handcuffs click around her wrists, the sound echoing through marble floors she thought would be her legacy. The HOA president, who spent months trying to crush me, smear me, bankrupt me, was being led out of a $6 million villa she'd built on my land. She thought she'd won. She thought possession would rewrite the law, and now she was losing everything right there in front of her supporters, the cameras, and me. It didn't start with flashing lights and arrest warrants. It started with something quieter, my own parents' deed from 1978, the one they signed when Willowbrook was nothing but farmland and gravel roads. I grew up on that soil, my dad hammering fence posts, my mom planting roses by the porch. Years later, when the developers came and formed the HOA, they built their cookie-cutter houses around us, but they never owned us. My property stood outside their little kingdom, or so I thought. One morning, I walked to the property lines checking the old survey stakes. That's when I saw her, Susan Peterson, the HOA president. Blonde, bob power suit in the middle of the dirt, strutting like a queen. Behind her were surveyors and even a county official already setting up equipment on my land like it was theirs. She smiled when she saw me. "Perfect timing, Mr. Grant. We're going to optimize this underutilized space for a wellness center. The neighborhood really needs it, don't you think?" Her tone wasn't a request. It was a proclamation, like she was doing me a favor. I kept my voice calm. "Interesting project, Susan. Do you have permits for construction on private property?" She waved me off like I'd asked about the weather. HOA projects don't need permits. We handle community development through our board. That was a lie, and both of us knew it. Luckily, my neighbor Frank heard enough. He'd spent 30 years in the county building department and walked over with his arms crossed. That's completely incorrect. Every project needs permits, especially on private land. Do you even have authorization from the owner? Susan's smile tightened. She tried to bluff, but the surveyor started packing up his gear. Even the county official looked embarrassed. Finally, she snapped, "We'll see about that." She marched off, heels kicking dirt like it was her personal runway. I should have been shaking with anger, but I wasn't. 5 years earlier, I would have lost my temper, called lawyers I couldn't afford, and ruined my own case. Not this time. I knew better. I had a deed patience and a phone camera. Sometimes you let your opponent dig their own grave while you hold the shovel. But Susan wasn't just ambitious, she was desperate. I caught her at the county building department arguing with clerks demanding permits for land she didn't own. Frank told me later she even tried convincing them that HOA presidents had community development authority. They laughed her out of the office. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. A few days later, a contractor pulled up to my driveway, nervous, clutching blueprints. He spread them out on his truck hood and whispered, "She told me this was a community center, but these plans... This is a luxury home. Gourmet, kitchen, wine cellar, 3-car garage. I don't want to be involved in something illegal." That's when it hit me. Susan wasn't just stealing influence, she was trying to steal my entire inheritance and turn it into her personal palace. And then the financial attacks began. My phone rang non-stop, insurance companies asking about construction on my property, the bank questioning modifications, tax offices warning of delinquent payments. Someone had filed reports in my name. That someone was her. One night she showed up at my door with her husband and a manila folder. She shoved it into my hands, announcing, "We've uncovered financial irregularities. You owe $12,000 in back assessments. This land is at risk of lien seizure for community safety." I flipped through this paper's fake tax records, bogus formatting, made-up charges. She actually thought she could bluff me with forged documents. Frank called it immediately. "These are fraudulent." I could spot that a mile away. But standing there, watching my wife Laura's face tighten with fear, I felt myself sliding backward into that pit I'd known before. 5 years earlier, I'd lost my house in another property dispute. I'd been naive, outmaneuvered, broken. And for a moment, staring at those forgeries, listening to the constant phone calls, I wondered if I was cursed to repeat it all again. Maybe I was the crazy one holding on to an old deed while the world moved on. Maybe I should just walk away. Laura grabbed my shoulder that night. "You're not the same man you were then," she whispered. "This time you know what you're up against. This time you have proof. Don't let her win by breaking you." That was the moment I snapped back. I wasn't powerless. I had the deed, I had neighbors like Frank, and now I had evidence of embezzlement. Because, digging deeper, Laura and I uncovered HOA records Susan had already drained $47,000 of community funds into her wellness center project. A smoking gun. I took it to the press. Channel 7's investigative reporter showed up with cameras rolling, neighbors furious as they learned their dues were paying for Susan's personal mansion. That was the turning point. She thought she could spin it as community progress, but I turned her own community against her with facts. Of course, she doubled down. Bulldozers rolled onto my land one morning, tearing through my parents' old garden. Susan stood there in a hard hat directing the crew like she owned the place. Neighbors gathered confused, and that's when she brought in Councilman Rick Torres, who stood beside her promising economic development and increased property values. It was all politics. She'd offered him HOA endorsements in exchange for his support. I stepped forward, raised my voice above the machinery. "Councilman who owns this land. Me or your friend here?" He dodged with politician's words. The crowd murmured, and for a moment it felt like I was losing. But I wasn't finished. I gathered residents in Frank's garage, showed them the financial records, the fake permits, the contractor's testimony. One by one, they turned. Mrs. Chen admitted Susan had tried to make her sign false statements. Rodriguez confessed he'd donated money thinking it was for community benefit. The anger spread like wildfire. Then came the HOA meeting. Over 60 residents packed into the room, whispers rising, papers rustling. I laid out the unauthorized expenditures. Faces went pale as people calculated how much of their money had been stolen. Board members threatened to resign. Frank stood and read building code violations. And just then a county inspector walked in with a stop work order. Susan lost it. "This inspector has no authority." "HOA projects operate under different frameworks," she shouted, voice cracking, eyes wild. Even her supporters stepped back. A district attorney's representative stood up in the back row, calm as stone. "This isn't a civil dispute anymore. We're investigating embezzlement, fraud, and property theft." The room went silent. Still, Susan wouldn't quit. She scheduled a grand opening party for her villa, invited officials and real estate agents, tried to present herself as untouchable. The house was stunning. I'll give her that: Brazilian cherry floors, marble bathrooms, custom crown molding. Everything she'd ever envied built illegally on my soil. Laura, Frank, and I walked in with undercover law enforcement. Susan beamed silk dress shining under chandeliers, guiding guests through her palace. That's when I raised my voice. "Thank you, Peterson, for building such a beautiful house on my land." The room froze. I held up the deed, the inheritance documents, the county records. Laura explained every charge: embezzlement, forgery, bank fraud. Frank confirmed the code violations, and then the DA stepped forward with sheriff's deputies. "Mrs. Peterson, you're under arrest." The cuffs clicked. Gasps echoed. Guests backed away, some bolting for the door. Others staring in shock as the woman who lorded over this neighborhood was marched out of her dream home like a common criminal. Federal agents piled on with bank fraud charges, talking about 30-year sentences. The villa stood bright and empty, a monument to arrogance, while she screamed that she'd been acting for community benefit. I just stood there, deed in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: quiet. She built my dream house while destroying her life. And the law finally caught up. Patience and persistence beat arrogance every single time.